Justice Department will not tolerate attempts by any foreign power.
Now, the United States has accused China of meddling into its domestic affairs through spies. Washington has prosecuted.
We will continue to fiercely protect the rights guaranteed to everyone in our country, and we will defend the integrity of our institutions.
Have you ever heard of a company called Huawei? Inside the US, you probably haven't heard them unless you're a tech enthusiast. But outside the US, and especially in Asia, they're ginormous. In fact, a few years ago, they overtook Apple and became the world's second largest smartphone seller, only beaten out by Samsung. And during the pandemic, they furthered their lead by overtaking Samsung as well. While this is awesome for Huawei and China, it may not be all that great for the rest of us. If you've been following international news, you probably know that Huawei has a sketchy past when it comes to surveillance and data collection. Now, this is nothing new given that basically every tech company does this. But there's one key difference between most tech companies and Huawei. Most tech companies collect your data to craft effective marketing campaigns and sell you stuff. Conversely, Huawei allegedly collects your data for the Chinese Communist Party. In fact, in 2019, the US actually outright banned Huawei in the country. Since then, tensions had been cooling down and Huawei was getting a break. But more recently, the pendulum has swung in the other direction once again. In late 2022, the US charged 2 Chinese intelligence officers for trying to steal data regarding the case against Huawei. Technically, we don't know if this case has to do with Huawei. The US only disclosed that it had to do with a large Chinese telecommunications company, but it's assumed that they're probably talking about Huawei. And it's not just court cases that they're apparently spying on either. The US accuses that China is using Huawei to also spy on radio communications from military bases, missile silos, and who knows what else. And with Huawei becoming the largest smartphone producer in the world, this threat is only growing larger by the day. So here's how Huawei rose to overtake Samsung and Apple, and how they could be using their market share to spy on the world for China. Taking a look back, the story of Huawei dates back to September of 1987 to a man named Ren Zhengfei. At the time, China was desperately trying to develop their technology and economy. For the past few decades, China had fallen quite behind due to internal conflicts and the Communist Revolution. But moving into the 1980s, China wanted to change that by embracing the free market to a degree. One of these efforts centered on trying to develop China's telecommunications infrastructure. Ren, a former deputy director of the People's Liberation Army Engineering Corps, was familiar with the effort and decided to leverage the situation. He got together a couple of investors and raised a total of $5,000 to start Huawei. You might be thinking that $5,000 isn't all that much money, especially to develop new telecommunications technology, and you'd be right. The point to note, though, is that Ren had no intention of developing anything himself. Instead, his plan was to acquire foreign tech and reverse engineer it using local researchers. And when I say reverse engineer, I don't mean trying to understand the tech and creating something new. I mean blatantly ripping off competitors and creating counterfeits. Ren's first target was a new telecommunications startup called Qualcomm. You may have heard of them. It turned out that trying to copy technology itself took quite a bit of time. So to start bringing in some revenue, Ren started to resell private branch exchange or PBX switches that he imported from Hong Kong. This revenue allowed the company to grow their reverse engineering team substantially up to 600 people. In terms of a company name, Ren simply settled on a slogan that would play well with the public. The original slogan was Zonghua Yu Wei, which means China has promise. Ren altered this to Huawei, or as it's properly pronounced, Huawei, which translates to China is able. The CCP was likely fans of this name, but that's not the only thing that attracted them to Huawei. By 1993, the company would successfully create their own telephone switch knockoff, which was magnitudes better than anything else in China. Huawei turned around and deployed these switches across small cities and rural areas where there wasn't much competition from the existing players. But likely their biggest and smartest move was partnering with the People's Liberation Army. In terms of revenue, this wasn't all that lucrative, but in terms of connections and influence, this deal was insane. The story goes that when Ren was pitching the CCP on the telephone switch, he told them, quote, "Switching equipment technology was related to national security, and that a nation that did not have its own switching equipment was like one that lacked its own military." Reportedly, the CCP official agreed, but if that's the case, why in the world is Huawei trying to get other countries to use their telecommunications equipment? Yeah, I think you can see where this is going. It appears that China truly did believe in Ren's statement, as they would triple down on Huawei and domestic switches. In fact, in 1996, China adopted an explicit policy that supported domestic manufacturing and restricted access to foreign options. Given that Huawei was the only Chinese company that was producing equipment that was comparable to foreign counterparts, Huawei became the go-to company for both the government and the military. They weren't just making strides within China either. Starting in the late 1990s, Huawei would aggressively expand to developing countries in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. These countries were easy targets given that most of them could not afford Western options. So there was really only two options: either they take help from the Chinese or they put off development. Obviously, they went with the first option. What's surprising though is that Western countries would soon jump onto the Huawei bandwagon as well. One of the first countries to follow was Canada when their telecom giant Nortel outsourced their entire production and engineering to Huawei. It appears that higher profit margins was simply something that many Western companies couldn't turn down. Don't be fooled though, switching to Huawei was usually a terrible choice. And it's not some sort of conspiracy theory, as it's usually blatantly obvious. Though Huawei, of course, always denies everything. Take Nortel, for example. Shortly after making a deal with Huawei, Chinese hackers would begin stealing hundreds of sensitive internal documents from Nortel for a period of at least 10 years. According to Huawei, this hacking has nothing to do with them, but you can take that for what you will. To make things worse, it wasn't just Nortel that Huawei was allegedly spying on. Huawei may have gained access to Canada's national defense through Nortel. Reportedly, listening devices were found in Nortel's Ottawa R&D complex. This complex worked extremely closely with Canada's national defense, so much so that after Nortel filed for bankruptcy, largely due to corporate espionage, this building would become Canada's National Defense HQ. For obvious reasons, Canada isn't letting Huawei come anywhere near their 5G networks. Canada wasn't the only country to learn the hard way either. Around the same time that Nortel signed their deal with Huawei, dozens of Western companies were also signing deals with Huawei. At first, this started off with background players like UK's Vodafone, Australia's Optus, Norway's Telenor, and Japan's Panasonic. But this quickly grew to encompass all of the American giants as well, including Google, Facebook, Qualcomm, Intel, and Microsoft. Since then, each and every one of the companies that I just listed have cut their ties with Huawei, either due to getting burned themselves or due to government bans. So fortunately, it looks like companies and countries started wising up to Huawei in the late 2010s. But this didn't matter all that much, given that Huawei had already shifted to a completely different ballgame. From the very beginning, Huawei knew that the end game was to reach end users. They couldn't quite do this from the very beginning, given that creating consumer tech and reaching everyday people is expensive. But thanks to all these contracts with companies and governments, Huawei was able to infiltrate the consumer market. And given that they were a telecommunications company, their product was obviously cell phones. Huawei didn't actually start out with smartphones. In fact, their first cell phone, the C300, came out way back in 2003. They followed this up with a 3G phone called the U626 and a 3G handset called the V710. These products performed alright in China and some parts of Europe. But Huawei's breakthrough didn't come until the introduction of smartphones, which they were perfectly positioned for. They were already in the telecommunications market, they were already in the cell phone market. They had full backing from the CCP, and they also had an international presence. On top of this, the company was mature enough where they didn't have to directly copy competitors. Instead, they could take inspiration and incorporate their own twist, which is exactly what they did with the U8220 in 2009. Since then, Huawei has become a leader when it comes to incorporating the latest networks, cameras, charging, and even designs. And the reason that their smartphones are so popular isn't rocket science. They make great phones that are usually cheaper than the competition. It's that simple. And today, they regularly ship more than 200 million phones every single year. I don't think you'd be surprised to hear that they've expanded to selling much more than smartphones either. They've got laptops, tablets, watches, and even a car. So Huawei isn't going anywhere anytime soon. But what does this mean for all of us? Well, whether Huawei wants to admit it or not, they're likely going to spy on and surveil as many people as they can. Many people who buy Huawei products are well aware of this, but they don't really care. They usually figure that even if it's not Huawei that's spying on them, it'll be companies like Google, Facebook, and Oracle. So they might as well forget about trying to protect their privacy and instead just focus on buying the best product for the best price. So that answers the consumer side of things. But what about Huawei's side of things? Why spy in the first place? Clearly, Huawei is extraordinarily popular, so why resort to allegedly spying for the CCP? At the end of the day, they are a hardware company, not a software company, so they shouldn't need to collect data, right? Well, the answer is that they have no choice. It was the CCP who made Huawei into who they are today, and the CCP can bring back Huawei to zero if they wanted to. And if you don't believe me, just look at Jack Ma, Alibaba, and the Ant Group. Over the years, the CCP has provided Huawei with $46 billion in loans, along with $25 billion in tax cuts. And who knows how much revenue the CCP has brought Huawei in the form of government contracts. Also, we should note that this has always been a one-sided relationship. While Huawei is dependent on the CCP is not dependent on Huawei. The CCP did not put all of their eggs in one basket, as they also have giants like Tencent, JD.com, Alibaba, TikTok, and the entirety of the Chinese financial system. So China basically owns Huawei, and Huawei has to do what the CCP says, regardless of how that will affect their own reputation or public image. Looking forward, while countries are doing their best to hamper Huawei's influence, and it's not easy to mitigate the control you get from having access to billions of users and decades of telecommunications infrastructure. And given that most consumers just see Huawei as another Facebook or Google, it's unlikely that we'll see much resistance from the general public either. So it's safe to say that Huawei won't have much trouble maintaining their dominance and allegedly reporting their findings to the CCP. Would you rather give your data to Huawei or Facebook? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if this video gave you more insight into the Huawei bans. And of course, consider checking out our Discord community to suggest future video ideas, and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.